Mother's Day Summary. The play starts with a scene of Mrs. Pearson and Mrs. Fitzgerald drinking tea during an afternoon in early autumn. Mrs. Fitzgerald is a fortune teller and is telling Mrs. Pearson's fortune. Both of them have contrasting personalities. While Mrs. Pearson looks pleasant but anxious, Mrs. Fitzgerald looks stronger with a sinister personality. The former is in her 40s, and the latter is older. The conversation starts with Mrs. Fitzgerald advising Mrs. Pearson to take a stand and be the boss of her own family. Mrs. Pearson replies meekly that it was not that simple, she was still fond of them even if they were thoughtless and selfish. Mrs. Fitzgerald reminds her that it is not acceptable to be treated the way she was treated by her children and her husband. Mrs. Pearson replies dubiously that she does try to drop them a hint, and she does not know how to begin. She looks at the clock and panics, saying they will be home soon and nothing is ready. Mrs. Fitzgerald tries to calm her down and asks Mrs. Pearson to put her foot down, but Mrs. Pearson does not seem to be sure about her capabilities. To this, Mrs. Fitzgerald replies that she will do it for Mrs. Pearson. The latter denies, politely explaining that her husband and children would resent Mrs. Fitzgerald. Then Mrs. Fitzgerald reveals her plan, which involves an exchange of their personalities. She then takes Mrs. Pearson's hands and chants a spell, after which Mrs. Pearson talks out of Mrs. Fitzgerald's body and vice versa. Mrs. Pearson, who is now Mrs. Fitzgerald, sounded alarmed at this transformation and expressed her fear in case they were not able to reverse their personalities into their own respective bodies. Mrs. Fitzgerald, who is now Mrs. Pearson, convinced her not to worry and go to her home. She could come back after some time to check on things. Mrs. Fitzgerald hurries back to her house while the real Mrs. Fitzgerald, in the form of Mrs. Pearson, waits for the children and husband to return home from work. She smokes away carelessly, whereas the real Mrs. Pearson has never smoked in her life. The daughter Doris, a pretty young girl in her 20s, bursts inside the room asking her mother to iron her yellow silk dress because she is going out for the night. She notices her mother smoking and starts questioning her. Mrs. Pearson calmly retaliates, saying there is no law against smoking. When Doris asks her mother if tea is ready, Mrs. Pearson informs her that she has had her tea and is thinking about going for dinner at Clarendon. Doris, who has now become sulky, reminds her mother that she works hard and Mrs. Pearson has always prepared tea and ironed clothes for her. Mrs. Pearson rebukes Doris's comments and reminds her that she works twice as much as Doris but gets paid in neither wages nor thanks. She also goes further to insult Charlie Spence, with whom Doris had planned to go out in the evening in her yellow dress. Doris is on the verge of tears. Mrs. Pearson's son Cyril arrives home after a while and starts asking for tea and things that he needs for going out in the evening. In a similar manner to how she put down Doris, Mrs. Pearson replies curtly to Cyril's demands and queries, implying that she could not care less. She reminds Cyril that everyone in the family expects her to listen to their rude comments and demands. She has decided to fight against it, just like Cyril goes to the union in case of any discrepancies at work. As Cyril stands there baffled by Mrs. Pearson's unnatural behavior, Doris joins him in the living room. She had been crying, and her mother just aggravates the situation by telling her that a crying face does not suit her for an evening out with Charlie Spencer. As Cyril tries to figure out what Mrs. Pearson could have possibly said to Doris, he finds her looking for some stout in the kitchen. Cyril and Doris talk to each other about the new development in Mrs. Pearson's attitude. They find the thought of their father dealing with Mrs. Pearson's behavior funnily intriguing and wait for his arrival. As Mrs. Pearson enters the drawing room with her stout, she intercepts the siblings' laughter and giggles and reprimands them for not behaving their age. When Doris asks the reason behind her sudden change in behavior, Mrs. Pearson replies that all the family members do is come home, ask her for something and go back again. She also threatens them by saying that her work of 8 hours is done and that she might go for an outing during the weekend. The husband, George, arrives home and is treated in the same way as Cyril and Doris. Mrs. Pearson also goes ahead to tell him how people at the club called him Pompey Ompy George. Mrs. Fitzgerald enters the house now and is worried about how Mrs. Pearson is treating the family members. She begs Mrs. Pearson to stop, but the latter seems furious at her family's behavior and scolds them to learn some manners. Mrs. Fitzgerald asks Mrs. Pearson to exchange their personalities back while Mrs. Pearson is intent on doing some more reforms in the family members' behaviors. But Mrs. Fitzgerald is no longer able to bear it, and Mrs. Pearson exchanges their personalities back. The original Mrs. Pearson starts talking in a pleasant manner while Mrs. Fitzgerald reminds her to be strict. Mrs. Pearson thus uses a strict tone with her family finally, and all seem to be aware of her problems and needs now. Cyril, Doris and George become polite and understanding in their behavior towards Mrs. Pearson. She proposes a nice game of rummy and asks them to help her with supper. Mrs. Fitzgerald wishes the family good night and leaves the house. The play ends. Conclusion of Mother's Day. Mother's Day Class 11 summary teaches us to take a tough stance when it is necessary. Mrs. Fitzgerald undertook the brunt of bringing Doris, Cyril and George to their senses. Mrs. Pearson, who was reluctant in the beginning, saw the change in her family members and decided that it was the right thing to do. Mrs. Pearson finally got the respect and attention she deserved. For more update, please like, share and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.